PMI has remained in contractionary terrain for a 14th month. The PMI shows the global supply chains disruptions on the back of the coronavirus spread have resulted in slower delivery times. The business activity and new sales orders indices lingered around 11-year lows in March. The nationwide lockdown imposed towards the end of March meant that most factories lost 3 working days in the month. The 21-day lockdown will result in 10 further working days being lost in April, suggesting a deep contraction is likely in April factory figures. Supply chain disruptions mean that production is also not expected to return to full capacity immediately after the lockdown is lifted. Absa says should the lockdown be extended, it would likely mean some factories could close down permanently. This will have a sustained negative impact on production and could also result in further job losses in the sector. Well, I'm joined on the line now by Absa economist Miyelani Maluleke. He's joining us via Skype. Thanks very much for joining us, Miyelani. Very horrible set of affairs happening in the economy, what with the lockdown, of course. But let's just reflect on what people in the manufacturing sector were saying in terms of that PMI that you released today.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I think it's a very difficult time for the South African economy, which, as we know, before the COVID-19 shock, was already in recession. So what we saw with respect to the manufacturing PMI data in March was that there was actually a slight improvement, which will obviously come as a bit of a surprise given the widening impact of COVID-19 that we're seeing both globally and domestically, which resulted, of course, in the president announcing the nationwide lockdown. So I think it's worth explaining a little bit just why the PMI went higher in March. So when we look at the underlying data, what we find is that the increase was driven entirely supplier delivery times. So in normal times, when supplier delivery times lengthen, that would typically be an indication of improving demand and an indication that businesses across the manufacturing value chain are a little bit busier, and that will be positive. But what we're actually seeing this time around is that the increase in supplier delivery times was entirely due to increased difficulty of sourcing inputs. Given the disruptions that COVID-19 has actually caused. So I think to understand the impact of COVID-19 on the manufacturing sector, we have to move away a little bit from the headline index to look at, other sub-indices such as business activity, new sales orders, and in there, what we're seeing is that there was certainly a lot of strain in the manufacturing sector. I mean, just as an example, the business activity sub-index fell to its lowest level since the global financial crisis in March.
And to what extent did the electricity outages impact the sector? Because we did have a lot of them. It just feels like a distant memory, but it was quite a lot at the time.
That's absolutely right. But I think if you look at March as a whole, the scale of load shedding was actually a little bit less compared to February. So in February, we had in the 29 days, 17 days of load shedding. In March, it was actually a little bit lower than that. But I think what we're actually seeing in March is manufacturers saying, it was getting a lot harder to source some of the inputs that they need globally and even locally. And of course, when the president came out to announce that, as part of the measures that the government would be implementing to contain the spread of COVID-19, they were declaring a national state of disaster and subsequently, a national lockdown. It also made things a little bit harder. So electricity certainly remains a factor, and I think it will be a factor post this lockdown. But for March specifically, I think what we're really seeing here is just the impact of the widening, COVID-19.
Yeah, we've heard in the mining sector some players having to declare force majeure, basically indicating to people who expect supplies from them that they're not going to be able to honor their contracts because of the lockdown situation. I suppose we're going to hear a lot of that in the manufacturing sector as well, because we do have a number of exporters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's worth pointing out, of course, that there will still be parts of the manufacturing sector that will continue to operate, specifically in food manufacturing. And we know that food manufacturing is about 25% of South Africa's manufacturing sector. So that will continue to operate. But many other parts, that are not directly involved in the manufacture of essential goods as defined by the government, we'll have to shut down temporarily. So I think it's quite likely that over the coming days and quite possibly weeks, we'll see more manufacturers come out and make similar kinds of announcements. And more importantly, even after the lockdown, I don't think that things will return to normal very quickly. It will take a long time for supply chains to be restored, and it will also take a very long time for demand levels to go back to where they were pre-lockdown. So I think the next few months are going to be quite tough for manufacturers, and I'm hoping that some of the measures that the government has announced will help those manufacturers who are already fairly marginal, and that we don't see widespread business closures that result in massive job losses in the economy.
Yeah, we do hope so. Thanks very much for your time. That was Miyelani Maluleke. He's an economist at Absa. So